Welcome to this lecture on sexuality, in which we will again use the methodology of the Wesley Quadrilateral to look at a really touchy and difficult subject that does intersect so many of our lives in so many ways. So looking first at Scripture, if we're going to get our head around so many of these different issues about sexuality, whether they be pornography or same-gender relationships or living together or divorce and remarriage, sex outside of marriage, all of these different topics that really are sort of interwoven into so many of the human experiences of the people to whom we'll minister and we ourselves, it's really helpful to at least start with what Scripture is inviting us into when it comes to the one flesh sexual union that is described there. So a few ideas that we can derive from Scripture is that whatever else is happening in the one flesh sexual union, Paul describes it as a great mystery of some kind. There's more going on than just a physical interchange between two people. Song of Solomon describes it as a sealing of hearts. There is an existential union of two people where, again, not just exchanging physical space with one another, but there's a relational space and an emotional space, a one fleshness kind of space where two are becoming one. I love how Frederick Bruner, in his commentary on Matthew, talks about this. He describes the sexual union, the one flesh relationship, as a physical union that results in a metaphysical communion, or something beyond the physical. There's a communion of two people that happens in our one flesh unions. Some of the old school versions of the biblical text will describe the sexual union between two people as knowing one another. Maybe Adam knew Eve or Abraham knew Sarah. And in that word knowing of the Hebrew language, it has some couple hundred nuances to it that's more than just knowing factual knowledge. There's a relational knowing, a spiritual knowing, an emotional knowing, as God has created this beauty of the one flesh relationship between male and female, where they're to know each other on the most intimate kind of vulnerable levels. I often wonder, as my wife Hallie and I have been on this journey for well over 20 years now, that we know each other so well beyond just the facts of one another that I can kind of tell if she's in the room or not in the room at any given moment. The room feels different when she's in the room versus when she's not. There's a knowing of one another. And it's even seen where science reveals that as people are in a one flesh relationship, over time, they begin to share one another's DNA, which always sort of makes me laugh, because when you see married couples after 40 or 50 or 60 years, they kind of start looking like one another. Maybe it's because they've shared such space together for such a long period of time and even began to swap some of the physiology of their DNA. So however else we understand the one flesh union from a biblical standpoint, it's far different than how we often understand it in our social context of today, where it's more about a physical thing that's happening between two people. There really is this tying together of two people on relational, emotional, and spiritual kinds of levels. Flipping to the human experience, actually next then from that, because that's true, these are pretty deep questions and conversations, and often fractures and places of pain and sorrow for a lot of people. As someone who's taught sexuality classes for the better part of 15 years, I've taken the tact to assume that if I'm in a room with 30 other people, including myself, that there's probably 30 and 31 stories behind the curtain of our hearts. There's probably any number of sexual experiences or pain or questions that people are experiencing. And so as ministers of the kingdom, we need to understand that people are probably very much hurting on this topic. And so like any of the other topics that we've talked about in here, but maybe this one even more so, in touching the deepest fabric of who we are, there needs to be a lot of care and compassion. Grace needs to cover the conversation. People need to feel the safety to come into the light about what's going on in their past and in their present. We also need to recognize that, derived from Scripture, but then intersecting with our human experience, that within the Hebrew language, there's a lot of verbiness going on, that we don't have the same kind of nouns in the Hebrew language that we do in English. It's much more of a verb-based language. And what that means is that we are verbs who are constantly changing and constantly being influenced, constantly being formed, and our physiology is changing, our emotionality is changing, our relationality, our spirituality is changing all day long. One theologian says it this way, that it's not a question of whether we're going to be formed, it's by what will we be formed. And many of us have had formational experiences in our sexuality that give rise to any number of ideas or thoughts or attractions and experiences. And just know that for our ministers of the kingdom, we need to be the kind of people that offer people hope and say, just because this might be true of you now, doesn't mean in your ongoing formation it's going to be true of you in the future. As Jesus has beaten the power of sin and death, he can bring that kind of power into our lives as well. From the tradition standpoint, it's interesting to look even outside the Christian tradition at what the witness has been as to what constitutes sexual union. Clearly within the Christian tradition, up until about the year 2000, it has been a united witness across the various streams and rivers of Christianity that the one flesh relationship was meant for a male and a female in the context of marriage. But when you go outside even of the Christian tradition and you start looking at the great Abrahamic faiths of Judaism and Islam as well, there's a very unified tradition within both of those contexts that the one flesh relationship is meant for husband and wife. You can go to Eastern religions of Buddhism and Hinduism and Shintoism and see the same united witness that sexual union was meant for just that kind of context. And it's interesting when you study the various traditions that then you can look at our current sits and leben or situation in life and wonder about, so why are we asking different kind of questions today? What is the origin of those questions? Why the departure from some of the historical traditions? What might be some of the sociological trends that are giving life to so many different expressions of sexuality? So always looking backwards on any topic, including sexuality, helps us better understand our current situation from the lens of tradition. And of course, science and reason, psychology, sociology, all of these things are incredibly helpful for people, once again, as sexuality hits us on the deepest kinds of levels of ourselves, to understand the psychological and emotional pain and well-being, to understand all of what's at play in so many of these different expressions of sexuality, biologically, physiologically, and again, emotionally and relationally. It's really helpful to educate ourselves on all of these topics too, so that we can best be equipped as ministers of the gospel to both understand the one flesh relationship, but also how to help people walk towards wholeness within the fractures that inevitably it seems so many of us are walking in.